great pleasure to be here to help present the findings of the Irish part of the INASC project. And I'm going to outline two elements of this project, the main findings, if you like, of these two elements. That I think we're probably at the heart, I think we would agree, we're at the heart of the project. They go by the rather ungainly titles of Workstream 2 and Workstream 3. Workstream 2 was a series of interviews conducted with 40 victims of domestic violence from around the country. Workstream 3 concerned a series of interviews with various professionals and people working within and with the criminal justice system. Obviously, given the time constraints, I can't go through all of the ins and outs, but I do want to start, assuming I can get this to work. Yes, methodology, you should be on? Yeah, cool. Okay, I want to start by just outlining methodologies so that you understand how the study was constructed. And the first point is to note that this project is part of a wider European study funded by European Union money to consider in particular the manner in which the needs of victims of domestic violence are being met. Those victims, the focus being on female victims. That's the focus of the wider study. All the partners to this study were asked to access, to the extent possible, either police and or prosecution files dealing with domestic violence cases. Now, in our case, the Director of Public Prosecutions has only a very limited involvement in domestic violence prosecutions. The vast majority of cases are brought at what's called a summary level, a district court level prosecuted by the Garda Síochána. Unfortunately, the Garda Commissioner declined to participate, and that's not a criticism, it's merely a statement. She cited various concerns, in particular data protection issues, and also, more importantly, a variety of changes being implemented throughout the Garda Síochána in the light of the inspectorate report. We, of course, fully respected the Commissioner's decision, disappointed by it, but we fully respected it. But it left us with a practical issue of where can we go to get information to contribute to this wider study. So we reoriented the study very considerably towards the victims of domestic violence. We interviewed 40 female victims from around the country, all of whom met certain criteria that I'll outline in a moment. It's one of the larger studies of its kind in this country, but it is subject to certain limitations, which I will also mention. So, these are the recruitment criteria. The women had to have experienced interpersonal violence. They had to have reported at least one incident of domestic violence to the Gardaí between 2010 and 2013. They must have been adult at the time of that report, and on a practical level, they had to have sufficient understanding of the English language in order to answer questions. Nationality was not a criterion, but we didn't have interpreters and translators, so there had to be a certain amount of English language ability there. They were also all recruited of necessity through the various agencies that are affiliated with Safe Ireland. So those are the basic criteria. We are aware, and we want to state up front, that there are limitations in the study. In the first place, we have made no attempt to check out any of the answers given. We have accepted at face value the answers, what we were told. That might be considered problematic, but we have no reason to disbelieve anything that was said to us. The responses tallied with prior studies. There are no outlying responses that leapt out. And this limitation is, of course, common to any study that is reliant upon interviews and questionnaires. So, that said, we acknowledge that we did not corroborate any of the answers Secondly, we acknowledge that 40 is a small sample. It is not representative. We drew our sample from people who have come forward to domestic violence agencies. There is, of course, a whole body of people who do not come forward to any agency. They are not represented. At the same time, we did try to spread the group across the country, more or less in proportion to the population spread. So we got a good overview, if you like, of experiences from around the country. And as you'll see in a moment, virtually every part of the female population, every constituency of the female population is represented in this 40 people. We do not assert that our findings are definitive, because they're not. They are indicative, and we suggest that they present a hypothesis that we hope we can build on and test in later, more wide-ranging, more representative studies. And thirdly, we had hoped to pick up some information about victims' experiences in court and court outcomes. But we found very quickly that the participants were unable to recall the kind of details that we were seeking with the kind of precision that we needed. That's not a criticism. Many of these participants had been involved in multiple court cases, either in looking for domestic violence orders in the district court, perhaps the circuit court, criminal prosecutions of their abusers, and so on. They simply weren't able to keep the details straight, and you can understand why. Nevertheless, from our perspective, it meant that we could not present that part of the study as we had hoped. So the study is, or at least workstream 2, focuses on the experiences and the impressions of these 40 victims of domestic violence of the investigative process and their interactions with the girl Conor. Now, the demographic profile. Again, just to give an indication of who we spoke to. The age range, you'll see is spread between 20 and 62. Virtually all of them had children, which is significant. I'll come back to that. Most were either Irish or nationals of the European Union. You'll notice there are also a substantial number who were part of the minority groups. Levels of education were relatively high. You'll also, I think, very significantly, the considerable majority of the participants had no independent source of income, and were dependent either upon the abuser or upon social welfare payments. And in terms of living arrangements, the numbers of participants who were married to their abusers and who were cohabiting with their abusers were identical. So again, as I say, while this is not a representative sample, it does touch on most of the constituencies that you would expect within the female population in the country. So, the first point I want to look at is the severity of the violence. There is, I think, a tendency sometimes to downplay domestic violence in our culture. We tend to focus on the word domestic, and we don't focus on the word violence. Which is both unfortunate and a little startling, because some of this violence is incredible in its severity. And in the report, we got two very detailed descriptions from two of our participants, one of whom we named Nora, one of whom we named Emma. And we reproduced them in the report in their entirety. I'm not going to read them now because they are lengthy, but they're worth reading to see just how severe this violence can be and how brutal it can be. But outside of that, we just consider some of the points mentioned here. Physical and emotional violence, 1/3 of the participants indicated that these were happening on a daily basis. Virtually all the participants suffered emotional and verbal abuse. 90% of them suffered physical abuse. Half suffered harassment. Threats accounted nearly 80% suffered from threats. It's also worth noting that previous research has pointed to certain kinds of violence as what are called serious risk indicators. These are indicators that the victim is at risk personally of homicide. They include things such as attempted strangulation, physical abuse while pregnant, threats to kill. Half of the small sample that we had, half, suffered one of those indicators in their first incident of domestic violence. So this isn't even necessarily a case of violence that follows an upward trajectory. It starts off fairly low and builds. Sometimes it will start at an incredibly high level, which is then maintained. Also worth noting that the violence doesn't necessarily start at the beginning of the relationship. In fact, very often it doesn't. In our sample, the average starting point was 21 months into the relationship. But there was one case where it started within a month. Another case in which it started after 7 years. Now, given the parameters of the study, we weren't able to probe the reasons why they started when the violence started when it did. But it's worth noting that there is no typical case here. It can happen at any point. It can start relatively low level and build, sometimes very quickly, sometimes very slowly, or it can start at a very high level. But it very rarely diminishes in severity. It's also worth noting that the abusers very often will take advantage of various circumstances in the relationship, particularly children. Children are a wonderful pawn that can be used. Threats to take the children away. You will never see your children again. One of our participants told us how her abuser waited until the children were around, particularly when she was holding her baby. As she's pointed out, very hard to defend yourself when you're holding a baby. This is the kind of violence that comes under the heading of domestic violence. Now, we don't claim that, of course, all incidents of domestic violence are that severe. Of course they're not. But some are. The point is that we should not assume that domestic violence is in some way attenuated because it occurs in a domestic setting. The setting is actually irrelevant. If anything, it's an aggravating factor. Second point to make is the continuation of the violence. This is a graph, I hope. Yes, it is. Okay, I hit return. Cool. This is a graph that we put together to try to show how long the violence can last. The lower line is the beginning of the relationship. The upper line shows the length of the relationship. The space between, basically, is the violence. Now, I should note that in order to fit this graph on a page, we had to condense. So we're talking about groups of 50 months. If we were to present that on a monthly basis, or even on a yearly basis, the picture would look even worse. It would look actually very, very scary, because it is. It's a graphic representation of the lives that some of these women have led. Should also note, however, that this graph only shows the ending of the relationship, not necessarily the ending of the violence. One of our participants, whom we assigned them names at random, obviously to hide, to protect confidentiality. One of them told us that after the relationship ended, she was threatened with death. Another, whom we named Grace, was continually harassed after the relationship ended. Emily told us that actually she suffered her most violent incident after the relationship ended. Anna was assaulted and suffered an attempted rape after the relationship ended. This, I think, is important because it begins to address what I think is probably the most common question asked in the context of domestic violence. Why didn't she just leave? Now, that's an interesting question. I think in most cases it is a well-intentioned, well-motivated question, but where do you start? On a practical level, it's not that easy to just walk out. There are all kinds of practical considerations. Where do I go? Where do I live? Most of these women had children. There's another issue that needs to be considered. There are educational concerns, protection of children concerns. So it's not that easy on a practical level to just walk out. We also know from research that is associated in particular with homicide cases and provocation cases, the concept of learned helplessness, in which person's initiative can be quite literally beaten down. The ability, the mental ability required to actually make a decision to leave is quite high. Because that represents an assertion of control, that the victim is taking back control in her life. That's a very difficult thing to do when you've been beaten down, maybe for 7 or 10 years. So on a psychological level, it's difficult to walk out. But even if she does, the violence follows. No, not in every case. And the research is mixed. Again, there is no set pattern here. Sometimes the violence does end when the relationship ends, but sometimes it doesn't. So this question of why didn't she leave is actually, it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the problem. And I think some of our findings go some way towards answering that question. It's the wrong question. Now, a large part of what we were trying to get was the impressions of our participants of the Garda response. And I should say that the motivating factor in this study was the victim's directive. The requirement in the directive that victims of crime be given a risk and needs assessment. That was really the focus of, that was the motivating factor behind this study. It's worth noting that the Garda Síochána has had in place a domestic violence policy since 1996, a very good policy, I might add. Really is a very impressive document. It takes into account all of the knowledge and understanding of the issue of domestic violence. It is explicit in requiring members of the Garda Síochána to fully investigate all allegations of domestic violence. It sets out a policy of arresting the abuser once there is evidence disclosing the commission of an offence or a breach of a domestic violence order. Obviously subject to Garda powers of arrest. They are extensive, but they're not unlimited. And it also recognises the ongoing nature of domestic violence. That domestic violence is very rarely a one-off event. It's a pattern. The responses that we got from our participants indicate that the policy is not always implemented. And I think the Garda Síochána itself would acknowledge that. There are examples of very good practice, examples of not so good practice. I've mentioned on the screen there that 53% of cases, the Garda Síochána came to the location of the domestic violence. Now, I should say that that doesn't necessarily mean that the other 47% the guards just hung up the phone. Of course they didn't. In many cases, the guards were asked specifically not to come. That the victim was informing them of an incident simply to inform them so that it would be on record. However, the participants did indicate that there was a marked reluctance to institute an arrest, even where they had a domestic violence order in place. It was probably the single biggest complaint of all the complaints, this apparent unwillingness to exercise the powers that they do have. That said, the assessment of the Garda Síochána was very mixed. There was wonderful praise, effusive praise. There was also stinging criticism, and we want to present both, because it indicates that to a certain extent that there has been a bit of a lottery, that the response a victim gets when reporting domestic violence depends on who they talk to. If they get a good sympathetic guard, they will have a wonderful response. If not, it will be rather different. So some of the praise that our participants gave said they were very good, very helpful. They were perfect. Can't really get better than that. They were perfect. The guard is after giving me faith. And I felt I wasn't on my own. That really was a big thing. The feeling that there was somebody out there looking out for them. Somebody to whom they could turn. We also found, however, that there was very little evidence of needs and risk assessment being carried out. Only 2 of our participants could recall any form of risk assessment. Now, it is possible, of course, that a risk assessment was carried out in other cases that they just didn't recall. Perhaps they didn't recognize it as such. It's equally possible that the guards conducted an internal form of risk assessment, which would not have been picked up in our survey. Nevertheless, I think it indicates one of the ways in which the Victims Directive is going to have a major impact in this area, because this form of risk assessment is now going to be mandated by virtue of the directive. In terms of criticism, well, there was criticism. And they tended to take 3 forms. Firstly, that the investigating guard didn't take it seriously. And you see there was no bit of fire in it. It's like you were taking them away from their dinner or something. There was an element of victim blame. Guard asked the victim, what had she done to upset the guy? And they felt alone. I didn't want to call the guards at all because I didn't have any help. And I think probably this criticism is summed up in the most poignant comment, is that last one, that I will forgive the abuser for everything he's done to me, but I'll never forgive that guard till the day I die. It's an indication of the impact that a negative response can have. Really powerful. But again, don't want to focus entirely on the negative. There was a lot of positive as well. It's mixed. But there's a lot, I think, a solid foundation there. And we understand that the Garda Síochána has instituted a lot of reforms in the light of the inspector's report, including a revision of the domestic violence policy. So we anticipate that hopefully when a follow-up study is done, that these results will improve markedly as a result. Now that's as much of workstream 2 that I can get through. I want to also mention workstream 3. This is the series of interviews with professionals working in and with the criminal justice system. Again, this is not a representative sample. We selected various professionals for the experience that they have, the insights that they could bring. But it's not a representative sample. We don't claim that it is. They also give us different perspectives. We have 40 victims who, of course, have a victim perspective. But their victims are not trained lawyers. They're not trained investigators. They don't understand very often the constraints that the system has to operate within. So it's important to try to marry the two. The first thing we could note is, from these discussions, that again, confirmation of what we discovered in workstream 2, that where prosecutions are brought, invariably, those prosecutions are brought at a summary level. In the district court, prosecuted by the guards, the DPP tends only to be involved in the more serious levels, the indictable offences. So if an incident of domestic violence leads to a homicide, obviously the DPP will be involved there. Or if there's a rape case, or something of that level, even the more serious forms of assault, that will go through the DPP. The majority, the very considerable majority, of cases that are prosecuted summarily in the district court. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the authorities are not taking this seriously. There are benefits to going through the district court, not least of which is speed. The district court can respond much faster than the circuit court or the central criminal court, where there's a whole procedure that needs to be followed. A very lengthy procedure, in fact. And indeed, one of the things that we discovered, and indeed that other studies have discovered, is that what victims want most of all is something to be done now. Not 8 months later, when the whole indictment process happens. They want it done now. Get him out of the house now. Protect me now. Going through the summary system is probably as close as the criminal justice system can get to doing something now, because it can respond much more effectively. The problem with it is that the district court is limited in the kind of punishments it can impose, and very often those punishments will not necessarily reflect the severity of the case. Secondly, in terms of investigation, many of the criminal justice professionals pointed out, and again this tended to tally with what the victims have told us, that very often the guards are reluctant to proceed unless there is a domestic violence order in place, a barring order or a safety or protection order. And indeed the victims said very often they were told, you need to go get a DVO. We can't do anything until you have a DVO, which is actually not true. It was very interesting to see the disconnect, well, an apparent disconnect. I'm not sure that it's a real disconnect, but an apparent disconnect between the legal professionals on the one hand and the support service personnel on the other. The legal professionals said the victims don't want to pursue this. They don't want to pursue domestic violence cases because of a variety of emotional, psychological reasons. The women's support services said that women don't want to proceed with domestic violence cases because of the sheer ordeal of going to court. Now, I'm not sure that there's actually a real conflict there. I suspect that if the support services around the criminal justice system were improved, that both sides would be satisfied, that the emotional and psychological bars could be addressed, and the ordeal of going to court could be reduced. Going to court is never fun. It's not supposed to be a fun process, but we can reduce some of the impact, and I think that in a way that would satisfy both sides of that equation. All of our interviewees also commented on the need for good investigative practices. Obviously enough. These are important cases. They need to be presented to the court in the most effective manner possible. And we were a little disheartened to find that some members of the women's support services echoing some of the criticisms made by the victims in Workstream 2, that very often is unfair, that sometimes the victims themselves are asked by their guards to conduct the investigation, or aspects of the investigation, to take photographs of the scene, take photographs of their injuries, to find the bat that he hit her with. That is obviously unacceptable on any number of levels. It's unacceptable from an emotional perspective, putting that burden on victims. There are all kinds of legal issues about custody of evidence, chain of evidence. There are constitutional issues. So that needs to be dealt with. And we trust it will be dealt with in the reviews that the Commissioner has instituted. Now, nearly there. In terms of repeat victimization, we discovered in Workstream 2 that there has been very little in the way of risk assessment and needs assessment. And that finding was mirrored by our discussions with the criminal justice professionals, who told us that the possibility of repeat victimization is not typically addressed. There's very little evidence of risk assessment being carried out. We hope that's going to change now as a result of the Victims Directive. Few special measures are put in place. That there are, aside from interpretation and translation services, few special measures are in place. And also that there is a fundamental disconnect between the civil and the criminal courts. Now, there's a limited amount of what can be done there. A criminal prosecution is not the same as an application for a DVO. And it is absolutely essential in a criminal case that the rights of the defendant are not prejudiced. But one of the problems with this is that a case is brought before the criminal courts, it is presented as a one-off event when in reality it's part of a very long stream. And the court therefore doesn't necessarily get the complete picture. So, in conclusion, you'll all be grateful to learn. The study demonstrates, firstly, the seriousness of the violence that is suffered by large numbers of people. Again, we're not claiming that this is a definitive study, but even in a small sample, the levels of violence are truly amazing. They're truly amazing. So this tendency to downplay the violence in domestic violence really needs to be addressed. Secondly, work streams 2 and 3 indicate that there is a gulf between policy and reality. To a certain extent, I guess there always will be. Policy is always going to be aspiration. But the thing about aspirations is you sort of have to work towards them, not stand static and certainly not back away from them. So once the policy is in place, we have something to work towards, and it's important that we do actually work towards that policy. We've also determined, and I don't think this will come as a great shock, that the Victims Directive is likely to have a serious impact on how the criminal justice agencies relate to victims. And while there has been a bit of a delay in transposing the directive, the agencies are already working towards it. And that's a very welcome, start to this process. Finally, again, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher. I just want to finish up by saying that it would have been really nice if we could have added to this some information on court outcomes, court processes, investigative procedures. For that, as we discovered, we need access to objective recorded information. Admittedly, some of that information may not be it may not in the past have been particularly well recorded, but we will need access to things like court documents, guard records, and so forth, if we're to get a full understanding of how domestic violence is dealt with in our criminal justice system. Thank you very much for your attention.